Africa's richest woman is worth more than $2 billion. Angola's Isabel dos Santos reportedly amassed her vast fortune while her father, former President José Eduardo, was in power. He ruled Angola for nearly 4 decades. But now dos Santos' fortune is at risk because her father is out of office, and the man he personally chose to replace him, João Lourenço, has launched a massive corruption crackdown, and he has the dos Santos family fortune firmly in his crosshairs. Today, we look at the rise and fall of political dynasties in Africa and other parts of the world, and what happens when women use their family ties to rise to power. Hello and welcome to Our Voices. I'm Hayde Adams FitzPatrick, and with me are Auriane Itangishaka. In for INBO this week is Salem Solomon, and also joining us here at the table is João Santa Rita from VOA's Portuguese news service. João, welcome. Put for us into context this whole story, because this family really embodies, in my view, on the continent, family dynasty or political dynastics, right? Tell us how this family acquired their wealth and how we got to where we are today with Isabel dos Santos' fortune now under the spotlight. Okay.
Let's start from the beginning. Angola was initially a Marxist state, as we know. The first president was Agostinho Neto. José Eduardo dos Santos succeeded Agostinho Neto when Angola was a Marxist state. After the changes, the fall of the Soviet Union, José Eduardo dos Santos was beyond a thought that Angola needed to create what he would call a national capitalist society, a capitalist class. Now, that's from where all the problem starts, because then we have a rush to the privatization of Angola's richness. And what happened in this case is that you have money from the Angolan state, from the oil, from the diamonds, being allocated to develop private enterprises. Okay? So even the Angolan company, Sonangol, invested by itself in a lot of private companies.
And this is the company that's probably one of the big controversial companies.
Exactly.
Isabel dos Santos.
And so then we reach this point, and what comes across now is that a lot of these state companies were supplying money to José Eduardo dos Santos' family, his daughter, his son, his other son, to form companies. And this is where the problem lies, because then what you have in Angola is a system of circles, of nepotism and patronage.
Yes. Speaking of the daughter, the children, the daughter is who's recently said that this campaign of freezing her assets and, basically just looking into their finances by the new regime is basically an attack against the father's legacy as well as her hard work and maybe even her legacy as a self-made billionaire. We had a chance to speak to her, Salem. What did she have to say?
Actually, that's a very good point. In fact, when I spoke to her, both herself and her husband kept mentioning that there's nothing illegal that they've done. And they referenced the court case and how even when they're dipping in different pots, the government pots to finance their private sector, that they were repaying the money that they've been taking. I spoke to her shortly after the court's decision, and she calls the allegations a witch hunt. And her husband, Sidika Dokolo, is also accused of causing the state to incur more than $1 billion in losses through a scheme that involved transferring foreign currency abroad and the state never being repaid. He visited our studios here in Washington, D.C. Here's a bit of background on their financial battle.
Some call her Africa's richest woman, but in her home country of Angola, she is known by her nickname, the Princess. The eldest daughter of the former president, José Eduardo dos Santos, rejects the title and says she is a self-made billionaire.
I'm just a businesswoman. I'm an entrepreneur. I work in 60 countries. I work in South America. I work in Asia. I work in Europe. And I work in technology, so I don't work with government contracts.
But in December, all of that changed when a court accused dos Santos and her husband of causing the state to incur more than $1 billion in losses through a scheme that involved 2 state-owned companies transferring foreign currency abroad and never being repaid. All of her assets inside the country have been frozen. She says It impacts thousands of her employees.
And these are private sector companies. This is thousands of employees. These are daily operations, things like supermarkets that have to open every day and sell.
But Rafael Marques de Moraes, a journalist and researcher from Angola, said the corruption under President dos Santos and his family was pervasive and fairly out in the open. He cited an example of Isabel dos Santos receiving a 50 million euros loan by a state-owned bank to set up a brewery and then seeking to repay it at a much lower rate in the local currency.
There was in Angola what I called in my thesis the transparency of looting. So it was right in the people's face. It was evident. There was no much effort in trying to hide the way President dos Santos was doling out state resources, state funds, public state banks loans to his own children.
De Moraes said if this type of illicit activity happened in another part of the world, it would be given a simple name.
Is what in Europe, in the US, and in Angola is called money laundering.
A leaked trove of documents by a group of investigative journalists showing mismanagement and embezzlement of public funds has now put the Dos Santos case back in international headlines, and Angola's chief prosecutor says she could face an international arrest warrant. Dos Santos' husband, Sindika Dokolo, who was named in the charges, said there has been no evidence put forth to date that he or his wife have benefited from corruption. He is determined to fight the charges.
I have never heard of corrupt kleptocrats as being the first job creators in their country.
So as you saw in that package, they kept emphasizing that they haven't done anything illegal. And also, you know what was interesting from both of them, what I heard is that they've never held government positions. She even said that I've never even advised my father on these decisions. I've never worked in state positions. There was a point in her business adventures, the Sanangol, the oil company, that she sat for a little bit over a year or so, where she says the company was bankrupt. And as her business acumen, she was sought after. She came and helped. She says, I was called just to rescue the company, is what she says.
One interesting fact was she keeps saying, when I'm listening to a lot of the reports that are coming out of Angola, is that she's a self-made billionaire. I mean, I remember one time in the media, she spoke to the media, who often calls her a princess, that she doesn't know any princess who wakes up and makes supermarkets. I mean, if I had my father as the president, I'm sure he will help me make those supermarkets. But I do believe that she's a very smart woman. It's unfortunate that the wealth that she has is a threat to the new regime, the new government. But I think that when you look at the World Bank's reports about how the country really relied so much on the oil, and the gains from the oil did not really trickle down to the small people and the regular citizens and the young people, I think in the courts of public opinion, she won't really have sympathy.
Oh, not at all. I mean, everybody is delighted in Angola that she's, apart from a few group of people that are worried, but they don't speak. But otherwise, everybody is delighted, because this was a family that was seen by everybody as enriching themselves at the cost of the state. And Angola has an incredible poverty. I mean, it's a country of
inequalities.
Yeah.
But when does this become a problem?
This becomes a problem. First of all, let me address something here. She is right in that all this that went to court, there's 15 pages of it here. There's nothing here saying that Isabel dos Santos committed something illegal. What it says is that they were given money by the state companies to form their own companies, and they haven't paid the money back. And so the state went to court and said, because there is a risk that they will take all the money out and sell all their assets, we got to freeze them. So there's no allegation here that they committed a crime. But what's happening here, to go back to your question, is that João Lourenço, the president, J-Lo as he is known, there's definitely an attempt to get rid of the Dos Santos
He's
control.
clearly targeting the family.
Because it's not only her. Look, her brother was in court charged with trying to transfer $500 million illegally overseas. The director of the National Bank is also in court. There's other people involved in the case. Her other brother controlled. The schemes were incredible. There was the public TV. It had 2 channels. Then 1 channel was given to a company that was controlled by the brother. So the brother was making money out of a state television channel. So there is definitely an attempt to put an end to the Dos Santos influence in the country.
Well, what is going to be the big lesson here for the continent? Because all of this is not unique to Africa for sure. I mean, even here in the United States, the Trump family has been accused of, mixing politics with family members and who own businesses, and that these two are so intertwined. And I'm sure many other dynasties are watching what's happening here. What do you think will be the precedent, and what will be the lessons learned from this?
Well, I think that the lesson is that when power changes hands, your family or your interests, if they are not legal or proper, are at risk. And in this case, I think what it is that the Dos Santos family power and all the people around them are a threat to João Lourenço's new regime. And therefore you have to cut them from the base, and this is what's happening. Pretty soon there's going to be criminal indictments, and pretty soon they're going to go after her money overseas. This is just a question of time.
The counter-argument to what you're saying about, especially Angola's case, is very complicated, because if you think about who is who's freezing whose assets, it's very important to look at this, because sure, the spotlight is on the former president's daughter because she's a billionaire, but also the president was the Minister of Defense under her father. Let's not forget that.
And also, handpicked, which makes this so strange.
That's the question.
Also, we are wondering what happened.
Speaking of corruption, though, if you think about also the vice president at the time, who was the head of the national oil company Sanangol, who was Manuel Vicente, accused of corruption, and there are so many family ties there, still is currently the Angolan president's advisor of the oil and gas. So that's part of the reason why we have to look at the government that is currently holding position. These are people who were under the former president as well.
People are wondering, though, what happened in the fallout between the president and the current?
Let's go back in history. It's true. João Lourenço was Minister of Defense, but there was a period in the recent Angolan history where João Lourenço was basically put into internal exile. What happened was that João Lourenço at a certain stage said publicly that he thought that it was time for President Dos Santos to go. Mm-hmm. Well, this didn't go well. Mm-hmm. And so he was basically frozen out of all power institutions. Then later he was rehabilitated, came back, and was chosen. And the reason why he was chosen, I think, it's because João Lourenço was a military man. Mm-hmm. And he had great support among the military and a lot of people within the MPLA. And this is another thing. So that the MPLA was losing credibility because of the rampant corruption. Mm-hmm. And João Lourenço could then campaign on a fight against corruption. And this is what's happening. Once you start that fight, you either take it to the ultimate consequences or not. There is bad blood between João Lourenço now and the Dos Santos family.
Only one of them is in power right now. This to me also just brings it back to why it is so important for some of our leaders to stay in power as a way to stay out of prison. Because it doesn't, if things turn and they lose power, they don't just run the risk of any of the next regime coming after them, but also after their families.
I just wanted to tell a funny story, because Isabel Dos Santos,
by all means.
Isabel Dos Santos says that she's a business. And look, I have no doubt that she's very capable, because she's got companies all around the world, and some of them are very successful, including in Portugal. So I have no doubt about it. The question here is, how did she start? Right. Well, she apparently said once in a television interview that she started as a young girl, as a teenager, selling eggs. And so everybody in Angola calls her the chicken that laid the golden egg. And the question that they make is, which came first, the chicken or the eggs? So that's it.
It's true, and I still believe in order to become a billionaire, you've got to start with $1 million at least.
Of course.
Somebody got to give you the millions.
It is all about the power as well, especially because Angola is heading to 2021 elections, upcoming elections. And so people are saying he's trying to live up to his nickname, the Terminator. And so part of the reason why they think that this is his agenda is because he wants to live up to his name and also root out corruption for that reason.
But to be fair, I mean, there's been a campaign against corruption that doesn't involve only the dos Santos family. Just a few days ago, there was a lot of arrests in Bengala, the third biggest city, all sorts of corruption deals. There's other people that have been arrested. The former Minister of Transport is now in jail. So it's not only the dos Santos family, but this is the base.
It's a hardcore attack.
João Santa Rita, thank you so very much for your time and for your insights. This was absolutely fascinating. Of course, if you have anything that you want to add to this conversation, what do you think about what is going on in Angola right now? Do you think there are lessons for the rest of the continent? Do tell us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Our handle is at VOA Our Voices. You can also find us on WhatsApp, and that number is right there on your screen. After the break, women and dynastic politics, the pathway and the pipeline to power. Is it a big deal anyway? Should it be? We'll talk about that when we come back. Being part of Our Voices is about more than just sitting here and talking about women's issues. It's about listening to them
and bringing their opinions to the table and making sure their voices are heard.
Because our lived experiences, our stories, and our voices will help shape the next generation.
Welcome back. We're talking about the politics of dynasties in Africa. Now, it's not unique to the continent. You'll find them just about everywhere. Think of the Bush family and the Kennedys in the United States, the Bhuttos of Pakistan, and the Aquinos of the Philippines, to name a few. But what happens when the women in these dynasties use their family connections to rise to power? In Africa, one of the more famous cases of a woman who rose to political prominence through her husband is Zimbabwe's Grace Mugabe. Well, of course, now she's had to change her future plans after her husband was ousted in 2017. Isn't that the truth?
That's right, Hayde. I spoke to one of our colleagues in the Zimbabwe service who talked to me about the concrete steps that were being taken for Grace Mugabe to be set up to be a successor of her husband's reign. Let's take a look.
To begin with, when she delved into politics, she had a plan, and that was very calculated. The starting point into entry for her politics was to make sure that she becomes the chairlady of the Women's League in ZANU-PF. Everybody supported her. So when they went for their Congress for the Women's Assembly, she was voted unanimously. She was not even contested. That was point number one. The second point was to target people who were potential, successors or people who were going to stand in her way. The first was the vice president, who was a woman, Joyce Mujuru. She campaigned for her to be removed, and eventually she was fired in December 2014 by the then president, Robert Mugabe. Then after that, she went on to the other remaining vice president, who is Emmerson Mnangagwa. Emmerson Mnangagwa was again fired by the then president, Robert Mugabe, in November 2017.
Where's she into now? People are wondering, where is she?
She's a grieving woman. She lost her husband. And also when the husband was forced to step down by the military, there was an agreement that they have to remain in the country, stay peacefully. But the problem with Zimbabwe is that when you get into politics, especially in opposition politics, you're actually putting yourself at risk. All what you had acquired through ZANU-PF will eventually be taken. So the situation is not okay for her. Entering into politics would be like a walk in a minefield for her.
Well, this is really going to be something very interesting to watch. You know, it's answered one of my big questions, where she is, what's going to happen now. But I couldn't help but notice that, you know, this is not scientific on my part, but the many times there have been women who have run for office or tried to rise to power on the African continent and who have failed. I mean, Jerry Rawlings's wife, she tried to run for president in Ghana. She didn't make it, but then also there were the efforts by men to use women in their families to stay in power. Jacob Zuma, of course, you know, accused of trying to use Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, his ex-wife, to make her the president, so his family could essentially stay in power. And so, you know, we always talk about how this is not unique to the continent. And so for a little bit more perspective of where else this happens in the world, where women have used their family ties to rise to power, we're joined now via Skype from Oklahoma, Farida Jalalzai. And she is from Oklahoma State University. She's also one of the authors of Blood is Thicker Than Water, Family Ties to Political Power Worldwide. Farida, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Farida, is this normal? Should we be surprised when people raise an eyebrow about women using their family connections to get into office or to try and rise up the political ranks? I mean, men have been doing it all the time. So is this normal? Should it be normal?
It's more common than perhaps one might think in this day and age. And it is widespread as far as family ties being a phenomenon. I study presidents and prime ministers worldwide. And in fact, where women are able to get into positions that invest them with more powers, they typically are more likely than their male counterparts to have these ties to prominent political families.
I mean, because men have other well-trodden paths to power. Women probably don't have as many.
I'm okay with it, actually, as long as the law of the land is permissible for women, whether she be an aunt, a mother, or a wife, to rise up to power, wherever destiny takes her. But the question for me is, what would be the challenges? I mean, we've seen in countries like Uganda where the First Lady is the Minister of Education. In South Sudan, she's one of the generals. What are some of the challenges that you see when women actually rise through their family all the way up to a very high-level position?
The challenges prove numerous, and I think that the biggest obstacle that one would face is, as a woman, being able to separate yourself from this connection to the family once you have that position. So being able to be viewed as not just a symbolic token. And I feel like women have more of an obstacle in being perceived as their own political player, because the assumption is that if she did have a family connection, that it's really that she has no political talent of her own. Whereas men, we may not even think through as much whether or not he has a credential to be a politician, because men are ubiquitous as politicians. So with women, their biggest obstacle is to be viewed as someone who also has their own political skill, their own political agenda, and deserving of having a seat at the political table.
Farida, I was looking at one of the excerpts from what you authored recently. You have studied over 1,000 political executives, and you saw that only 66 women were rising to the positions that they had based on merit. And I'd like to bring your attention to one of the examples that you point there. Liberian President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf celebrated. She made her campaign against corruption as #1 public enemy. But she presided over notoriously corrupt government, even when they rise through merit. Any thought on that?
In general, I think that another factor that comes into play where women are able to rise to power is political instability. And women can perhaps leverage stereotypes that we have of women as being cleaner, less corrupt, less violent. What is difficult, if we're going to go back to, well, what are some of the obstacles even someone who comes in on her own merit has to encounter, is that Liberia was corrupt and violent to begin with, correct? And it's very difficult for someone, even if they are committed to creating a more just society and a more equal playing field to root out aspects that are endemic to a particular context. And so there's also, with the expectations that women are going to be better leaders that some hold, the greater fallout that they may feel for not doing as much as people may have expected to fundamentally transform the society. If I were to think about another country where we had higher expectations of a woman in a very corrupt society, I think about Brazil. The fact that they're dealing with so many difficult problems that their male counterparts were never able to solve, pulling that together with how we may have greater expectations that women will do better as leaders, when reality is such that it's nearly impossible to make fundamental changes. You're seeing kind of this recipe for disaster and negative repercussions during that person's tenure in the aftermath of their leadership.
And one other point that also worries me, of course, is what does this do for broadening the field of women from other sectors of society having access, of course, to. So I'm kind of, torn, access to political power. Maybe it's a problem somewhere. Maybe it's more acceptable, less acceptable in some places, depending on where you go. It is here, and apparently we're living with it. That's how the world works. Farida Jalalzai is from Oklahoma State University. We do thank you for your time.
Thank you.
We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll tell you what one Liberian author and activist thinks every child should know about corruption. Stay with us.
Welcome back. Robtel Niajai Paley's experience while working in Liberia's highest political office inspired her to write a children's book about corruption. Bugba, which is loosely translated as trickery in Liberia's Bassa language, explores ideas around ethics, accountability and integrity through the lens of 8-year-old twins Sandemar and Sandegar.
So interesting. I would love for my 7-year-old to read that book.
I would love for corrupt people's children to read that book. But yes, no, I think it's an amazing idea. And she's actually got a sequel as well, which talks about the trappings of telling the truth, because children, she says, are inherently truth tellers. And what changes that? Society, and as sad as that is. But I think it's a fascinating idea.
I think so too.
It's a good thing that you have to pass on to the next generation through books, through literature. Mm-hmm. So, doing the right thing.
These things way ahead.
Doing the right thing has to be passed on through,
never too young to learn that. Mm. And we're going to do the right thing now and close the show. Thank you very much to our guest, Salem Solomon. Thank you for always being here with us. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time. Until then, it's goodbye.